Good evening and welcome. My name is Colin Hennessy, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Executive Director of the University of Chicago Alumni Association. The Alumni Association, with the support of our amazing volunteers and community members, many of whom are in the room this evening, presents programming around the world ranging from social gatherings like Phoenix Fest to tonight's intellectual engagement event as the Harper Lecture. And let me add, just for a minute, that tonight's Harper Lecture has the most pre-registered people ever for a Harper Lecture. Nearly 700 people wanted to join us at this event this evening, so congratulations to all of you who found a seat. Thank you for being with us. Now, before I hand the mic over to our volunteer chair, Charmaine Owens, I want to take just a brief minute to provide some updates on the University of Chicago. Now, as you may imagine, there are far too many developments for me to share en masse, so allow me just to highlight three. First, the University of Chicago welcomes the brightest minds and boldest thinkers, regardless of their financial background. We believe that no cost should prevent a student from joining our community, and we support that value with the Odyssey Scholarship Program, our flagship financial aid initiative. Odyssey helps to unleash the potential of bright, talented, and motivated students by giving them full access to the University of Chicago. The university's commitment to increasing access is amplified by our recent announcement to be among the first elite universities in the United States to offer a test-optional option when applying to the college, a decision that, along with our Empower initiative, has helped to level the admissions playing field. It's resulted in a 20% enrollment increase in first-generation college students in the college, a 56% increase in enrollment of students from rural communities, and 14 veterans at the college this year. Second, as we near the conclusion of our historic Impact and Inquiry campaign, the campus is transforming to meet the needs of our modern-day students. From new college houses and the Harris Public Policy's new home at the Keller Center to Logan Arts Center and thoughtful renovations and facelifts to old favorites like the OI and the Science Quad, there has never been a more exciting time to be a student at the University of Chicago. Simply put, we believe that great minds need the best resources, tools, and spaces to solve the most pressing challenges of our time. And finally, in May of this year, the university announced the news of a $100 million commitment from the Pritzker Foundation to form the nation's first school dedicated to molecular engineering. The Pritzker School of Molecular Engineering will expand the university's research, education, technology development, and impact in molecular engineering, which builds on advances in basic science to design technology from the molecular level up, providing pivotal new approaches to fundamental societal challenges. It is the first school at the University of Chicago in 3 decades, and our first dedicated to engineering. These highlights only explore the surface when it comes to the exciting activity happening on our campuses in Hyde Park and around the globe. The University of Chicago is without question an engine of innovation, inquiry, and impact, changing the world. The willingness of alumni and friends like you to give back to the university at all levels through your financial support and your ongoing engagement is a remarkable tribute to the conviction of our community and one we are all truly grateful for. It is now my pleasure to introduce the Alumni Club of Chicago's Board of Directors Volunteer Chair, Charmaine Owens, to introduce this evening's Harper Lecture speakers. Thanks again for joining us this evening.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this evening's Harper Lecture. I am Charmaine Owens, Graham School MLA 98, and current Alumni Club of Chicago Board of President, as Colin stated. The Alumni Club of Chicago has 25 board of directors who organize 50-plus volunteer-led events per year, including annual favorites such as tours of the Argonne Lab, French cooking classes, and now in its 8th season, and I shamelessly plug my event, the annual Grant Park Summer Broadway Concert. With more than 55,000 alumni and 14,000 parents in the greater Chicago area, we hold 2 Harper Lectures per year on various topics. Tonight's lecture, How to Save a Constitutional Democracy, seems to be quite timely given what is currently happening in Washington. Our speakers for this evening are Aziz Huq and Tom Ginsburg. Aziz Huq is the Frank and Bernice J. Greenberg Professor of Law and Mark Clayster Momelin Teaching Scholar at the University of Chicago. He is a 1996 summa cum laude graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and a 2001 graduate of Columbia Law School, where he was awarded the John Ordronaux Prize. Professor Huq's teaching and research interests include constitutional law, criminal procedure, federal courts, and legislation. His scholarship concerns the interaction of constitutional design and individuals' rights and liberties. His pieces have garnered the Association of American Law Schools Junior Scholars Paper Competition Award in criminal law and have been selected for the Harvard, Stanford, Yale Junior Faculty Forum. Before joining the law school faculty, Professor Huq worked as associate counsel and then director of the Liberty and National Security Project of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, litigating cases in both the U.S. Courts of Appeals and the Supreme Court. He was also a senior consultant analyst for the International Crisis Group, researching constitutional design and implementation in Pakistan, Nepal, Afghanistan, and Sri Lanka. He clerked for Judge Robert D. Sack of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit and for Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg of the Supreme Court of the United States. And now that she has reached rock star status, also known as the notorious RBG. In 2005, Professor Huq received the Graduating Students Award for Teaching Excellence and serves on the American Constitution Society Board of Directors. Tom Ginsburg is the Leo Spitz Professor of International Law at the University of Chicago, where he also holds an appointment in the Political Science Department. He holds BA, JD, and PhD degrees from the University of California at Berkeley. Professor Ginsburg currently co-directs the Comparative Institutions Project, a National Science Foundation-funded data set cataloging the world's constitutions since 1789. His latest book is How to Save a Constitutional Democracy, which he co-wrote with Professor Huq in 2018. His co-authored book, The Endurance of National Constitutions in 2009, won the Best Book Award from the Comparative Democratization section of the American Political Science Association. His other books include Judicial Law Review in New Democracies in 2003, Administrative Law and Governance in Asia 2008, Rule by Law, The Politics of Courts in Authoritarian Regimes with Tamir Mustafa 2008, and Comparative Constitutional Law with Rosalind Dixon in 2011. He has served as a visiting professor at the University of Tokyo, Kyushu University, Seoul National University, the Interdisciplinary Center Herzliya, the University of Pennsylvania, and the University of Trento. Before entering law teaching, he served as a legal advisor at the Iran-U.S. Claims Tribunal, The Hague, Netherlands, and he has consulted with numerous international development agencies and governments on legal and constitutional reform. Professor Ginsburg is also the co-director of the Center on Law and Globalization. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professors Aziz Huq and Tom Ginsburg.
So thank you so much to everyone for coming tonight. We're going to be talking about our book, How to Save a Constitutional Democracy. And it's no secret now that constitutional democracy as a concept and as a phenomenon is in some trouble around the world. Every year since 2006, political scientists who study these things tell us that there are fewer democracies around the world. In 2017, we hit the point where more people in the world live in non-democracies than democracies. and there are less democracies than non-democracies. Actually, that year also marked a very significant development. The Economist Intelligence Unit, the Economist magazine's sort of research arm, found for the first time that the United States had fallen from the ranks of what they call full democracies to what they call flawed democracies, on the basis largely of the way we run or fail to run elections. And so this is a concern globally. Democracy seems to be on the downswing. Autocracy seems to be on the upswing. Very sophisticated forms of authoritarianism that may appear on the surface to be democratic. Today's autocrats have elections and courts and media that might appear to be independent, but in fact are increasingly under the control of single figures or single parties. Now, this phenomenon has sort of garnered a lot of different observation, different studies, different commentary. One of the things that we notice is that the way democracy ends nowadays is sort of different than in our imagination, particularly our constitutional imagination. So, I think a lot of the work in constitutional design, in thinking about protecting democracy, focuses on a phenomenon of a sudden collapse of democracy. A military coup or a communist revolution. We have to keep certain parties from competing for power because they're anti-democratic. And turns out that's not actually how democracy dies anymore. Democracy dies not through the fast route of sudden collapse, but rather through a slow route, a sort of death by 1,000 cuts, which we call democratic erosion, in which a number of individual steps are taken against particular, involving different democratic institutions, each of which on their own might seem to be okay on its face. But when you add them up, you get this kind of systemic degradation of democracy. And that's really what our book is about and what we're trying to address. Now, we identify two different agents which carry out this program. One is what we call the charismatic populist, and the other is what we call the partisan degradation. And I'll say a word about each. The charismatic populism is a phenomenon that we now see around the world. We have leaders who claim to be the single voice of the single people. That is, the people are conceived of not as kind of a pluralist group of entities which are debating and deliberating, but as a single people with a single interest whose views and whose interests are only known by the leader themselves. The leader claims a distinct sort of connection with the people, and of course anyone who doesn't agree with that leader's position is automatically not part of the people. The other people don't matter. And we see that language, that rhetoric all over the world. We see it in Turkey, we see it now in India increasingly, one of the world's most successful democracies in very difficult conditions, is undergoing very severe degradation and erosion right now because they're led by a charismatic populist. We see it arguably in the United States, and we see the claim spreading. Now, the problem for democracy with a charismatic populist, and generally speaking, populism itself is not a bad thing. You get populism as a natural reaction in electoral politics when the elites are sort of out of touch and not delivering policies that people want. But when you try to govern as a populist, or you're a charismatic populist, the problem is that you are distrustful of any intermediate institution between the people and the leader. And that leads to systematic programs that we observe around the world and we describe of trying to degrade these intermediate institutions so that the leader has the direct voice of the people. So that's one mechanism. Another mechanism that we observe is what we call partisan degradation. And that occurs when a political party is fearful that it really is not going to win in future electoral competition and sort of upsets the chessboard and defects on the possibility of continuing really competitive elections. This often occurs because of a general problem that we observe in lots of political systems, which is party systems are in big trouble nowadays. And when you think about the causes of these phenomena, we see in many democracies, party systems are kind of changing and in some cases eroding, in some cases collapsing. And when you have a void, right, that's perfect opportunity for a charismatic populist to say, all these parties, they're all corrupt, I alone can save the country. That move works well. It's also the case that if the party system is collapsing, you might have a party that thinks, well, we can't really trust this other side. Reciprocity is broken down, and it might just be time to defect on democracy. So those are two mechanisms. I mean, there's two sort of big punchlines of the book, or two motivations. The first is that we are writing against the idea of American exceptionalism. Since the founding of our country, right, there's been this trope that we're the United States, we're different, we're unique, shining light unto the nations, and the problems of the rest of the world and the forces that affect us will not affect them, will not affect us. That we're somehow immune by virtue of our vast size and the oceans between us and the other continents and such. And we reject that wholeheartedly. We think that forces that are corroding democracy around the world are very vital, very present in the United States, and we must be, therefore, aware of them. It's often a kind of common response to say, well, we have the Constitution. It's the best thing since sliced bread. It's, what's kept us going for so long. And actually, we show that not only does the Constitution in many ways not fail to save us, but in many ways it actively contributes to democratic erosion. It provides a kind of opportunity structure for certain kinds of strategies, and we'll talk more about that. So America's not exceptional. The other thing that we point out and try to address in our book is that there's a lot of sort of discussion of the phenomenon I've mentioned so far. But one thing that few others have really focused on is the role of law. When you look around the world at the various little steps that are taken to erode democracy, law is a tool of autocrats nowadays. Control of the courts is critical. And that means, of course, that if law is part of the problem, it must be part of the solution. And so we try to come up with some various mechanisms that we think might be optimal for constitutional design in the first place. We also identify mechanisms, legal mechanisms, that are used for erosion.
So by way of preface to a exposition of those legal mechanisms, I think it's useful to say something about how we came to identify the particular forms or the particular contributions that law can take as a contribution to democratic backsliding or democratic erosion. When one looks over the period that Tom described since the first decade of this millennia, there have been sequential waves of democratic backsliding, i.e. reductions in generally shared or generally agreed upon aspects of a polity that are necessary for a democracy. For example, real electoral competition, an open and free public sphere, the possibility of exit from power by an incumbent rather than the incumbent holding onto power. There have been waves of democratic erosion in several different continents. The first is in Latin America, in the so-called Bolivarian revolutionary countries, such as Venezuela and Bolivia. There's a second wave of democratic erosion in Eastern Europe that is galvanized by the electoral victory of the Fidesz party in Hungary. It spreads to Poland, where the Law and Justice Party mimicked many of the measures taken by the Fidesz party, and has traveled from there to other countries like Czechoslovakia, Austria. We've seen mimicry of some of the forms observed, and the political tactics observed in Eastern Europe, in Germany on the part of AfD, and in France on the part of the National Front. In the Middle East, we've seen Egypt, Israel, and further afield, India, and even Japan, copying or adopting many of the instruments or tactics that they've observed elsewhere. So what we observed when we took stock of the democratic decline globally that Tom described was a common set of measures being adopted by charismatic populist leaders as a way of loosening the constraint that democratic competition imposed upon them and reducing the possibility that they would be, at some later point in time, removed from power. And it shouldn't be a surprise that there is a common vocabulary and toolkit of democratic erosion. As the account that I just offered implied, there are linkages and commonalities across backsliding countries. The Bolivarians learned from the Venezuelans. Measures that are employed in Venezuela in the early 2000s turn up in North Carolina, as we might mention later, about a decade later. Right? Within the European context, there is conscious mimicry between right-of-center charismatic populist parties, both in terms of the kind of political claim-making that gets employed, but also in terms of the specific measures, the specific legal technologies. And we would be awry if we failed to acknowledge that part of this global diffusion of anti-democratic technologies is the contribution of US lawyers. Right? Many of the people, particularly in the European context, who are responsible for finding legal mechanisms to unpick the constraining force of democratic competition, were trained at leading American law schools and went home and applied their skills in their home countries against democracy. Right? So how do they do that? What are the tools? Right? I think what I'll do is I'll talk about three of them. I'll hand over to Tom for the last two, and then we'll circle back to press on the point that Tom made about the US's non-exceptionalism and the vulnerabilities created by our 230-year-old Constitution, a Constitution that hasn't been regularly updated, like many other countries' constitutions are, and that doesn't benefit from the learning that other countries have incorporated, encoded in their documents, thanks to, in particular, post-World War II experience. Right? So I'll give you three pathways that are employed by backsliding democracies around the world. Tom will give you another two, and we'll come back to the United States. So the first of these pathways is the use of constitutional change to dismantle different elements of democratic competition or institutions that are necessary to a democracy. Examples of this come from Venezuela, where both Chavez and Maduro have relied upon what they call constituent assemblies in order to dramatically reorganize the allocation of governing authority within the country, and to do so in particular in the face of and as a way of undermining electoral threats from people like Juan Guaido. Right? The deployment of constitutional change by a charismatic populist is particularly potent because the charismatic populist claims to uniquely vocalize the soul of the people, right? And in the terms of the political scientist Jan Werner Muller, they do so in a way that is moralized and anti-pluralistic. We stand for the people. We stand against, and it's usually a bifurcated set of enemies. There's usually a set of corrupt elites and a set of outsiders, be they immigrants in the United States, be they the United States and its allies, if you're standing in the shoes of Maduro, or be they gays and lesbians, which is the current bête noire in Poland under the Law and Justice Party. Right? So claiming to speak with the authority of the nation, the process of constitutional change becomes a natural and obvious way to circumvent restraining institutions. So we don't just see this in Venezuela and Bolivia, we also see it in contexts like Hungary, where upon its narrow electoral victory, the Fidesz party of Viktor Orban used in this very cunning but technically lawful set of ways the processes of constitutional change to entrench themselves in power, both in the legislature and as against a court, a Supreme Court, that until that time had been one of the leading lights of European liberalism. The key move, which is worth fleshing out in the Hungarian context, was this. Hungary's constitution used to have a rule that you could not amend it without a 4/5 majority. The 4/5 supermajority rule, however, wasn't clearly protected by a 4/5 majority. So Fidesz used the accident of they had a 2/3 majority to change the general amendment rule for the Constitution, and then proceeded to alter districting procedures and to attack the courts, and I'll come to the courts in a second, in ways that essentially eliminated probably the most important check on Orban's effort to accumulate power that existed in the political ecosystem at the time that Orban came to power. Okay, that's constitutional change. The second mechanism that we observe across these jurisdictions is the elimination of what in the United States gets called interbranch checks, right? This is the idea that you have at the national level usually, right? We have some things to say about federalism in the book, but let's keep out for a second the problem of sub-state entities, which turns out to be more complex than people think. At the national level, many constitutions have some kind of fragmentation of authority. Many constitutions divide powers between legislatures and executives in various ways. Some constitutions even break away certain oversight authorities into ombudsmen or independent oversight bodies, right? So Hungary's constitution did this, for example, with respect to corruption, with respect to the media. South Africa's constitution is actually a best in class in the world and does this for a whole range of things. The other interbranch check, of course, is the courts, right? The assumption, right? The assumption is that courts are somehow standing apart from the political process and therefore able to enforce existing norms of legality and democratic regularity against parties that want to defect from the democratic game. Across jurisdictions, what we see is through a variety of almost always legal measures, a elimination of these what in the American context would be called interbranch checks, right? Although they don't take the form of branches in other countries, right? So, for example, one of the most important sets of changes that both the Hungarian and the Polish charismatic populist parties pursued was the elimination of courts as a potential barrier to their exercise of authority. And they did so through devices such as changing the retirement age for judges. Lower the retirement age, and you, in both contexts, have the practical effect of purging the judiciary of many figures who would, under other circumstances, stand in your way. The other kind of purge that we see is more naked. So, for example, in Turkey, which is another example of a jurisdiction where democracy seemed to be flourishing, and under the charismatic leadership of Erdogan, has withered on the vine in a very rapid and, by some light, somewhat unexpected turn of events. We have the ordinary civil service laws being employed to dramatically thin the ranks of the judiciary of individuals who might resist the ACT Party's agenda and perhaps favor the more secular model of government that was associated in particular with Turkey's military. Right? So there's a variety of different instruments that can be used to thin or capture institutions such as the judiciary. Right? These tools can also be used against independent ombudsmen. In Hungary, you saw the ombudsman's offices all taken over in the sense that the individual who held that position was fired, a new person was brought in, the new person was closely aligned with the Fidesz party and operated in a way that was consistent with Fidesz's interests. The third mechanism, and it was a mechanism that I think surprised us a little bit when we came to the project, focuses not upon interbranch checks, but on the possibility of constraints from within the bureaucracy. right? And maybe the best way of telling this story is by pointing to instances in which the bureaucracy has actually played an important role. One of our follow-up pieces of research from the book looks at places where democracy has almost failed, but that somehow has come back from the brink, right? And we show that Colombia in 2012 was such a case, Sri Lanka in 2015, and then Finland in 1942, I believe. A commonality across these cases is that there are bureaucratic figures, election supervisors, people responsible for law and order, right, like the police, and in some instances the military, where the military plays a domestic security role, who turn out to be vital in checking the ability of a charismatic populist to unwind the democratic game. We normally think, right, and the prevailing political rhetoric of the United States encourage us to think that bureaucrats stand in opposition to democracy. Either we can have bureaucrats or we can have democratic rule. That's just not true. You cannot have a democracy unless you have career, independent-minded civil servants who are there to receive the vote, tally the vote, and report vote totals. You cannot have a democracy, a functioning democracy, if you have a police force, an investigative cadre of prosecutors, or a set of judges who are inclined to elevate the interests of one party over the praxis of democracy as a going concern, right? Democracy, it turns out, is vital, bureaucracy, it turns out, is vital to the persistence of democracy and is therefore the object of purge, of transformation across backsliding democracies.
So there's two other things you would do if you're a putative autocrat that wants to take over. And the obvious one is to control the electoral machinery itself, right? And so we see attempts to replace electoral commissions, attempts to redraw boundaries. Actually, our central exhibit here is, in fact, the United States. And here, just to foreshadow some of our critiques of the American Constitution, remember Madison and his colleagues were writing that document in an era before political parties. They didn't really think there would be political parties. They thought their design would immunize the system from parties. And so who did they give the power to run elections to? State legislatures. Well, those turn out to be, of course, the proverbial fox guarding the henhouse, and we see increasingly elaborate strategies to entrench power by state legislatures. And so those partisan bodies turn out to draw the districts such that it's often said voters in the United States don't choose the politicians, politicians choose their voters. And that's obviously a grave affront to the nature of democracy, which requires elections that are ex ante competitive. That, by the way, is something that's a bipartisan problem, lest it would be thought that we're on one side or the other here. That we see examples on both sides. We also see, obviously, efforts to disenfranchise voters. And we've just seen a massive attempt by Modi in India to eliminate 1 million people from the voter rolls in Assam, in a far eastern part of India, mainly Muslims. That's his preferred target group. And we also see a very interesting strategy that, again, as he's mentioned before, originates with Hugo Chavez and then spreads to North Carolina, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And that is, when you lose an election, before the new person can come take office, you change the powers of the office. So that's what that's what state Republicans did in North Carolina and Wisconsin successfully. In Michigan, actually, their effort was vetoed by the Republican governor, Rick Snyder, before leaving office, and that's obviously admirable. That's someone who's committed to democracy as a going concern. But that's of grave concern when you, in essence, don't acknowledge defeat at the polls by eliminating the powers of the office. The other sort of realm of things you do when you're trying to take over a system is to degrade the public sphere itself. And this, of course, we see all over the world. The idea of fake news, attacks on journalists. Journalism has become one of the world's most dangerous professions. And I think more journalists were killed and kidnapped last year than ever before. And obviously, you can't have a functioning democracy without freedom of the press, without freedom to criticize. And we see this as a grave threat. Civil society around the world is subject to all kinds of new onerous regulations, more sophisticated tax audits and various registration requirements that are squeezing the ability of civil society to act in many countries. And I would add finally, and particularly important to this audience, universities. A very famous example is the Central European University in Hungary, which was shut down and forced to move to Vienna because of its affiliation with George Soros. But it was, a very significant, important university, a beacon of liberalism in an illiberal country, and that was intolerable. And in other countries, we also see, places like India, we see sort of creeping regulation of universities. Universities have an essential role to play in democracy, obviously. We are committed to epistemic truth. We're committed to finding out, following inquiry wherever it goes. And of course, that doesn't need much of a selling job to a University of Chicago audience. But if you don't have that, then on what basis can we criticize facts? Universities, I think, have a big role to play in making sure that democracies are resilient. So these are the various channels. And if we look at the US Constitution and kind of evaluate how we do, well, we don't actually do that well, right? It's true that constitutional amendment is really hard in the United States. So we're sort of immune from a particular individual taking over the system and amending the Constitution to stay in power forever. Although that has a perverse consequence, which it channels a lot of pressure for constitutional change to the courts, which have expanded their own power dramatically, such to the point that we are now fighting presidential elections over who gets to make judicial appointments to the Supreme Court. That's crazy. But that's our system, and in some sense, it's a byproduct of the difficulty of constitutional amendment, although, from our framework, the fact that constitutional amendment cannot be easily manipulated is probably a good thing. We have a preferred system we like, which is amendments are proposed in one legislature and adopted by the next one after an election. So that means if you have an amendment that's a proposed amendment that's going to change the whole system of democracy, at least the people all get a chance to monitor it and vote and mobilize around it. So elections, we do so-so. The separation of powers in the United States does not work as Madison wanted it to work or thought it would, because he didn't anticipate the parties, right? So we know that Congress, and actually today's a perfectly good day to illustrate it, Congress is not acting as Congress. The Democratic House has one position, the Republican Senate will have another. And they're not defending the interests of Congress qua Congress, it's parties. And so when we have unified government, it looks very different than when we have divided government. And that's something I don't think was anticipated. The courts, maybe I'll let Aziz talk a little bit more about that, but we don't think the courts do a very good job in terms of playing their role in checking the executive branch. And I'll just say one other thing, which is, the one dimension we think the United States does very well on is the public sphere, right? We do have a vigorous public sphere. We have an extreme version of freedom of speech that no other country really has quite as robust a tradition, and we are strong defenders of that, and we think that's important. Do you want to say a little about the courts?
Sure. I think when one talks about the courts, it's useful to take a long perspective and not to focus solely upon the Roberts Court, and to ask whether, in the sweep of American history, the Supreme Court and the federal court system have done more to hinder or to help democracy. It's worth remembering that for a good portion of American history, right, from the 1890s up until the 1960s or early 1970s, depending on how you measure these things, the United States was not really a democracy. It was characterized by what political scientists call subnational authoritarianism. That is, across the American South, a substantial and, as we know from the 1890s, outcome determinative block of voters were systematically excluded from the polls, right? African Americans. And the Supreme Court, over that period, dabbles in a series of cases called the white primary cases in the 1910s and 20s, with starting to nibble away at white hegemony in the South over the political process, but does very little. right? The Supreme Court has no meaningful role in improving the quality of American democracy, at least until the 1950s. When the Supreme Court does start to intervene to broaden the democratic franchise, it does so in the context of education, in the famous Brown v. Board case. Levels of educational segregation, however, remain essentially unchanged in the American South from 1954, when Brown is decided, to the mid-60s. It is only when Congress enacts the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that the franchise opens up to African Americans. And the most important constraint upon American democracy in the modern era, at least after the bar to women voting was removed in 1919, not by the Supreme Court, is loosened, right? The Supreme Court does not have anything to do with that. It is true that there are some Supreme Court decisions from 1965 until roughly the middle of the 1990s, I would say my characterization ends in 1990, that are facilitative of the democratic process. It is exceedingly hard to find opinions after 1990 that have that effect, whether one's looking at the decisions interpreting the Voting Rights Act, whether one is looking at the court's treatment of what it calls racial gerrymandering, or whether one looks at campaign finance reform cases, the courts, or whether one looks at what the court has done most recently in the North Carolina case, Raucho, with respect to partisan gerrymandering, the court has never been a friend of democracy. And that is as a historical matter, true. Right? So the idea that the Constitution contains some set of resources, whether they be institutional in the form of the checks and balances, which are compromised by the party structure, or the courts, which, as a matter of historical precedent, have never stood by democracy, right? The Constitution simply doesn't help. And there are elements, and this I think is the last thing maybe we'll say, there are elements of the constitutional order that positively hurt the prospects of democratic survival. Probably the most important of those is the argument made available by Article 2 of the Constitution, the article that describes the executive, that all powers that plausibly can be characterized as executive are necessarily vested personally, or their supervision is necessarily vested personally in the president, right? This means, as one of our colleagues at Northwestern has recently argued, that any kind of investigation run out of the Department of Justice without plenary control by the president is unconstitutional, right? So the argument is that the Mueller investigation and anything like it is unconstitutional, right? Notice, as the last week has demonstrated, that to a large extent, Congress, when it exercises its supervisory powers, when it exercises its impeachment-related powers, depends in some measure upon the investigative functions of the Department of Justice. Congress doesn't really have a terrific apparatus to engage in investigation. And in a world in which that investigative apparatus is purely at the discretion and disposal of the president, how is impeachment supposed to work? So I think that's just one example. We have plenty of others, and I'm sure there's questions. But I hope that gives you a flavor of the arguments in the book.
So the floor is open for questions.
And just to be clear, we can't see anything.
Yeah, right. We're
There's
blinded
really
by the
bright
light.
lights.
Blinded by light. It's a Manfred Mann song.
Hello, very interesting. I look forward to reading this. I suspect we may be having a longer exchange in emails afterwards. For the moment, I have a semi-rhetorical question for you. Even just looking at the title here, Constitutional Democracy, I came up in a generation where the distinction between a democracy and a republic was key conceptually. I would further observe that while Madison may not have observed and anticipated parties in their present form, a key reason for non-direct election of senators was to put a check on popular passions, which is something we subsequently eliminated. So my semi-rhetorical question for you is the very phrase republic, small r, passé? And if not, how do we check the masses over here and the demagogue over there?
Do you want to do that? If one examines Madison's notes, for example, the notes he prepared prior to the Philadelphia Convention on the optimal design of constitutions, one sees that a principal concern held by Madison, held by George Washington, held by many others, was the emergence of legislatures at the state level that were populist-minded, and in particular minded to increase taxes on real property. There was great fear among the particular class that sat in Philadelphia and drafted the Constitution about redistributive legislation. And there are many features of the Constitution that are explicable in terms of that fear. The indirect election of senators is one of them. The takings clause is another. Madison had a variety of different schemes for reining in state legislatures, only some of which made it into the Constitution. This anti-redistributive motive in the framing of the Constitution has largely dropped out of the constitutional imagination. And over time, the Republican conception, right, and the word Republican has a complex meaning linked back to Roman and Machiavellian political theory that is too complex to get into here, has given way to a far more demotic and democratic understanding of the terms of constitutional rule. I don't think either of us are originalists in the sense that we think that the implicit form of democratic government that the framers believed in, a form, by the way, that was perfectly consistent with the peculiar institution of slavery, is one worthy of any particular reverence. We do think that there are important moral values in democracy, and that, I think, is the institutional arrangement that we're interested in finding ways to defend, not the arrangement that necessarily can be identified in the writings of Madison or his slave-owning cohort.
Hello. There's been discussion of adding seats to the United States Supreme Court. I'd be curious to get both of your comment.
Yeah, I think we have an op-ed on this at some point that we've done, but there's a lot of interesting proposals. It's actually kind of exciting for scholars, because scholars have been playing with this for some time. Now, all of a sudden, all these political candidates are grappling onto these various ideas. And, a lot of novel ideas. One thing I think that we say in the book, and I think we agree on, is that life terms doesn't make much sense. It might have made some sense at a time when the life expectancy was 60. But the incentives now, of course, are to appoint an ever younger cohort of judges who, by definition, we know less about, and then give them power for 6 decades. It's rather crazy. No other country does it. There are many other countries that do have the term lifetime appointments, but they all have mandatory retirement ages. And so I think that the optimal redesign of the Supreme Court, whatever you want to say about the number of members, would be something like an 18-year term. I think would be advisable. In terms of the number of members, I think our op-ed said, it's been a bit of time, but that what ought to happen if there was a change in power, we don't favor partisan packing of the court. What we favor is restoring the status quo ante by expanding the size of the federal courts in general. There aren't enough judges in the United States, as anyone sitting in the bench can tell you. There's not enough capacity for what we demand that they do. And so expanding the courts, ideally in a bipartisan way, with a set of judges who would be given to the president on the basis for an up or down vote by the president, that the Senate would sort of pre-confirm these people on a bipartisan basis. Now, the political incentives or probabilities of that may not be realistic right now, but I think that's a good way to restore the status quo ante of trying to get more moderate judges, less partisan, and ones who would be, and restore capacity to the courts.
I have a slightly different view from Tom, and what I think I'm about to say, I don't know if you share this view.
We'll find out.
Yeah, I guess. So I teach a class called Federal Courts, which is about the federal courts, and I start out by getting the students to read the text of the Constitution, and I ask them how many federal courts do there have to be according to the Constitution. And the answer is the Constitution requires one court, the Supreme Court, and it requires one judge to sit on that court. Everything else is at Congress's discretion. And indeed, throughout the early republic, up until sometime between the 1890s and the 1920s, when the judiciary became itself a powerful interest group capable of mobilizing and effectuating legislation on Capitol Hill, up until that point, Congress vigorously exercised its power over the jurisdiction of the federal courts to decide what kind of cases those courts could hear. So for example, we commonly think that the federal courts are there to hear federal claims, right? Cases that arise under federal law. Well, up until 1871, federal courts had no per se power to hear federal claims. All of those claims were heard first in state court, right? People forget. We have a history of Congress aggressively using its authority to shape the jurisdiction of the federal courts to achieve specific policy ends. I think that the proposals to add justices to the Supreme Court in an important way fail to grasp the deep and systemic problem that emerges from the way that the federal courts are now organized. The deep and systemic problem is best characterized by the following fact. Last year, 3 people in the United States got money damages recovery as a consequence of having their constitutional rights violated by a police officer in the United States. It is effectively impossible, because of judge-made doctrines, to vindicate one's constitutional rights, particularly if one is subject to state coercion. The federal courts today fail to provide citizens with remedies for ordinary constitutional violations by state officials. The reforms that Congress could undertake ought to fix the federal courts with reference to their role in remediating ordinary people's constitutional rights, and the power to do so lies in Congress's authority over jurisdiction. Solve that problem, and many of the objections about the partisan and politicized nature of what the court otherwise is doing fall away.
Go ahead.
Okay. Hello.
And apparently this is the final question that we have time for. So
Well, I've noticed you talked mostly about like Hungary, Poland, and India, which was very, very interesting. But I'm surprised you didn't say a word about France and what's been going on with the yellow vest. And especially, I would especially to know what you think of the fact that President Macron refused the RIC, which would be a referendum through which the French people could have their say and vote about the main political issue in France. Do you call this democracy? I'm just curious.
I think you're better situated than me to do that.
Am I? So I don't know what the referendum that you're referring to is, but let me answer that question in the context of a jurisdiction which I do know about, which is the United Kingdom, which is where I grew up, because there's the same question that arises around referenda. In the United Kingdom, under the unwritten constitution that English lawyers like to imagine and kind of conjure, there is no provision for referenda. And the referenda that was held in 2016 over exit from the European Union was explicitly framed as an advisory election. It's an advisory referendum, if one looks closely at the words. And the dynamic that has emerged is that there is a claim made largely by Brexiteers that the referendum result embodies vox populi. This is the people truly speaking, right? And the counter-argument to that, the counter-argument is, well, no, we have a set of institutions that channel and organize the expression of political preferences, largely in the United Kingdom through Parliament, right? So without knowing the specifics of the referendum that you're describing, I think that the way that I think we would think about that is, what is the role of referenda? What is the role of initiative, or the kind of the raw expression of public sentiment through policy by policy votes under the French Constitution, right? And is it already a mechanism that is intended to provide a channel for policy choice, right? I would flag that, at least in the American experience, those states that have embedded a referenda or initiative process, like California, have moved themselves into a world in which they're incapable of raising revenue and have locked themselves into budgetary commitments that are essentially unsustainable, thanks to contrary public votes, right? So we can talk about this later, but I'm looking at...
Basically, you think that democracy is good, but too much democracy is bad.
Maybe I can say something. The way I would say
Something
it
like that.
is, well, but
No,
the point, just a minute.
You
the
know,
point,
I'm just curious, that's it.
the point about institutions is that, in a constitutional democracy, we have institutions which channel democratic preferences.
Sure.
And those differ from culture to culture. France has a tradition of referenda. The United Kingdom does not. And that means that, what's appropriate is different in different cases. But I would not say that referenda are always democratic. They're very easily and very often subject to manipulation.
Sure.
And I think on that note, we have to end, because I'm getting the signal.
I'm not taking position. I was just curious.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professors Ginsburg and Huq, for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, again, I'm delighted that you all chose to join us this evening for tonight's Harper Lecture. If you're excited about other ways to be a part of the University of Chicago Alumni Association, talk to me, one of my colleagues, or visit alumniandfriends.uchicago.edu. And if tonight has you longing for our gorgeous Gothic campus in Hyde Park, please come visit us for the homecoming block party this Saturday on campus. And with that, our reception starts just behind us. Thanks again for joining us.